July 1944. The island heat settles heavily over the coral airstrip on Saipan. The fighting has moved inland, but the war has not gone quiet. It hums in engines, in generators, in the steady clatter of American mess kits. Near a temporary enclosure, Japanese prisoners of war sit in the shade, thin uniforms hanging loosely from their frames. Many have marched for days on little more than water. Some have not eaten properly in weeks. They watch without speaking. Across the wire, U.S. soldiers form a familiar line, not for ammunition, not for orders, for food. Steam rises as lids come off metal containers. The smell reaches first, cooked meat, unmistakable even in the tropical air. Beef, sometimes pork, thick cuts, not ceremonial portions, served again and again, every day. At first, there is disbelief, a quiet assumption that this must be temporary, a special ration, a display. Then the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Americans eat like this routinely. No speeches, no celebration, just another meal, eaten standing, leaning against trucks, laughing softly. For the men watching from the other side, something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because in that moment, the war begins to look different, and the reason stretches far beyond the battlefield.
Long before Japanese soldiers ever encountered American rations in the Pacific, food had already been defined as a weapon, just not in the same way. In the decades leading up to the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese Army built its logistical philosophy on restraint. Endurance was considered a virtue, hunger a test of character. Military manuals emphasized simplicity, self-sacrifice, and spiritual strength over material comfort. A soldier who could fight while hungry was considered superior to one who required abundance. At the center of this system was rice. White rice was more than sustenance, it was cultural identity. Japanese rations were designed around it, supplemented by small amounts of dried fish, pickled vegetables, miso, or soy-based protein. In theory, these rations were sufficient. In practice, they depended on a stable supply chain that Japan would struggle to maintain once the war expanded across thousands of miles of ocean. Early victories masked the problem. In 1941 and early 1942, Japanese forces advanced rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, one position fell after another. Supplies captured from colonial powers temporarily filled Japanese depots. For a brief period, the system appeared sustainable, but expansion came at a cost. Japan lacked the merchant fleet capacity to sustain long-distance, high-volume resupply. Fuel shortages worsened the problem. American submarines began targeting Japanese shipping with increasing effectiveness by mid-1942. Each sunk cargo vessel did more than remove weapons or fuel. It removed calories. By 1943, the consequences were visible. On island garrisons across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Solomons, Japanese soldiers began living on reduced rations. Rice shipments arrived late or not at all. Protein became rare. Medical reports from the period describe malnutrition, beriberi, and extreme weight loss. Units were ordered to grow crops where possible, but jungle agriculture could not replace industrial supply. Yet, doctrine did not change. Commanders discouraged complaints. Hunger was framed as an expected condition of service. Soldiers were told that the enemy suffered the same shortages or worse. Imperial propaganda emphasized American softness, claiming U.S. troops relied on luxury and would falter under hardship. The reality was more complex. Japanese soldiers were not ignorant of food. Many had worked in agriculture or fishing before the war. They understood scarcity. What they did not fully grasp, because they had never seen it, was the scale of American production. Across the Pacific, a different system was forming. By late 1942, Japanese intelligence reports noted unusual quantities of enemy supply ships near contested areas. American forces were able to land, fight, and remain in place far longer than expected. Encirclement no longer guaranteed starvation. Siege tactics lost their effectiveness. Still, the full implications remained abstract. Most Japanese soldiers never encountered American supply operations directly. They saw the results only indirectly: fresh enemy troops rotating in, wounded men evacuated, positions reinforced again and again. Food, when mentioned, was secondary to weapons. That perception would not survive direct contact. As Japanese units began to surrender in greater numbers during 1944, particularly in the Marianas Islands, the invisible infrastructure of the American war effort became suddenly visible. Prisoners were no longer fed improvised meals. They were fed from the same supply system that sustained front-line U.S. troops. And it was there, standing behind wire enclosures and field kitchens, that the first real comparison began. A comparison not of ideology or courage or discipline, but of what modern war could deliver to a single soldier 3 times a day. Because while Japan had asked its men to endure hunger as proof of loyalty, the United States had chosen a different approach, one rooted in production, planning, and scale. And that difference was about to become impossible to ignore.
While Japanese soldiers were being trained to accept hunger as a condition of service, the United States was doing something entirely different, quietly redesigning how a modern army ate. Even before Pearl Harbor, American military planners understood a lesson learned the hard way during the First World War. Hungry soldiers fight poorly, recover slowly, and lose morale faster than any unit under fire. Food was no longer treated as a background concern. It became a logistical priority equal to ammunition and fuel. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it did so with an industrial base untouched by bombing and a population capable of mass production on an unprecedented scale. Factories that once produced consumer goods were converted to military supply lines almost overnight. Among them were canneries, meatpacking plants, refrigeration facilities, and food laboratories. The responsibility fell largely to the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Their task was not merely to feed soldiers, but to feed millions of them across multiple continents in every climate on Earth. Food had to be portable, preservable, nutritionally balanced, and psychologically sustaining. Taste mattered. Variety mattered. Regularity mattered. By 1942, the system was already in motion. American soldiers in the Pacific were issued standardized rations: C rations for hot meals when kitchens were available, K rations for combat situations, and later specialized jungle and assault rations. These were not luxurious by civilian standards, but they were consistent. They contained meat, real meat, often canned beef, pork, or Spam-like products, along with bread, coffee, sugar, chocolate, and powdered milk. Most importantly, they arrived predictably. The U.S. Navy built an enormous logistical bridge across the Pacific. Refrigerated cargo ships, something Japan lacked in sufficient numbers, carried frozen meat thousands of miles from the American mainland. Floating cold storage depots followed the fleet. Engineers constructed airstrips, docks, and supply dumps as soon as islands were secured. Food moved forward with the troops. By 1943, American supply doctrine emphasized rotation and replacement. Units were pulled back, refed, and rested. Fresh rations were issued even under fire. Soldiers might complain, as soldiers always do, but hunger was not an accepted condition of combat. This abundance was not accidental. American planners believed that well-fed soldiers recovered faster from wounds, resisted disease, and maintained fighting effectiveness longer. Medical Corps data reinforced the belief. Caloric intake was measured, protein requirements were calculated, meals were designed to support sustained operations, not merely survival. From a distance, Japanese observers misinterpreted this system. They assumed American reliance on supply lines was a weakness. Cut the lines, and the army would collapse. It was a logical assumption, based on their own experience. What they underestimated was redundancy. Where Japan had one supply route, America had 5. Where Japan rationed scarcity, America replaced loss with volume. By 1944, the contrast was stark. As Japanese garrisons on islands like Saipan and Tinian exhausted their supplies, American forces landed with full kitchens, medical units, and reserve stockpiles. Even during intense fighting, food distribution continued. Meat remained part of the daily ration, not a morale bonus, not a reward, but a baseline expectation. This was the system Japanese prisoners would soon encounter. Captured soldiers were processed, medically examined, and fed according to U.S. Army standards and international law. They were not placed on reduced rations. They were not punished with hunger. Instead, they were introduced abruptly and without explanation to the same supply network that sustained the men who had defeated them. For many, it was the first time they had seen an army that treated food not as a test of endurance, but as an instrument of power. And when Japanese soldiers began to observe American troops eating daily meat as a matter of routine, the difference between the two war philosophies became painfully clear, not in reports or propaganda, but in smell, portion size, and repetition. Because this was not a single meal, it was every meal. And that realization would soon open a series of reactions, human, cultural, tactical, and psychological, that went beyond hunger itself.
The first reaction was not anger, it was confusion. For many Japanese prisoners, the sight of American soldiers eating full meals, regularly, calmly, without ceremony, did not immediately register as reality. Hunger distorts perception. It convinces the mind that what it sees must be temporary, staged, or exaggerated. Surely this could not be how the enemy lived every day. But the meals continued. Morning brought coffee, bread, sometimes canned meat. Midday brought hot food when field kitchens were operating. Evening brought more of the same. The rhythm did not change. There was no visible rationing, no reduction after battle, no sign that scarcity lurked just beyond the next shipment. From a human perspective, the contrast was overwhelming. Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to associate meat with rarity. In many units, protein had become symbolic rather than nutritional. Small fish portions, occasional soy-based supplements, sometimes nothing at all. Meat, when available, was reserved for special occasions or officers. By late war standards, many enlisted men had gone months without it. Seeing American soldiers eat meat daily was not just surprising, it was destabilizing. Culturally, food had carried moral meaning. Japanese military culture emphasized self-denial. Endurance under hardship was praised. Hunger was framed as a shared sacrifice for the emperor and the nation. Soldiers who complained were seen as weak, morally suspect. To suffer quietly was honorable. The Americans violated that entire framework without ever acknowledging it. They ate openly, casually, sometimes joking while they did so. There was no attempt to hide abundance, no speeches about strength or virtue. Food was treated as routine, no more significant than cleaning a rifle or writing a letter home. This casualness struck Japanese observers deeply. In post-war testimonies, several former prisoners described the same sensation, a sudden, uncomfortable awareness that endurance alone did not equal strength. that suffering was, in fact, not universal. The enemy was not starving alongside them. The enemy was operating under an entirely different assumption. From the enemy point of view, this realization carried a quiet humiliation. Imperial propaganda had long depicted Americans as indulgent and undisciplined, fat, lazy, dependent on luxury. The expectation was that such soldiers would collapse under pressure. Yet here they were, healthy, energetic, and well-fed in the middle of an active war zone. And they were winning. The psychological weight of that contradiction was heavy. Some prisoners initially laughed at the rations. Not mockery, more disbelief, nervous laughter, a coping mechanism. They assumed the food must be special treatment for cameras or inspections, or that the abundance could not last, that sooner or later American soldiers would experience the same hunger. But days passed, then weeks. The laughter stopped. What replaced it was silence and observation. Japanese prisoners began noting patterns: supply trucks arriving on schedule, food waste discarded without panic, extra portions distributed when available. They watched Americans trade food casually, as if it were replaceable. For men trained to measure every grain of rice, this behavior was incomprehensible. Yet it forced a reevaluation. Hunger had been presented to them as a universal truth of war, a constant, a test everyone endured. But here was clear evidence that hunger, at least in this war, was optional if an army possessed the means to prevent it. This realization did not instantly break morale. Japanese discipline remained strong even in captivity, but it introduced doubt, a slow, corrosive doubt that propaganda could not easily counter. If the enemy could feed its soldiers this well, this far from home, what else could it sustain? That question lingered in the background of every observation, every meal, every supply convoy. And as the war continued, the answer would become clearer, not through words or interrogation, but through repetition. Because the Americans did not stop eating this way. And the longer it continued, the more unavoidable the conclusion became. This was not generosity. It was capacity.
What Japanese prisoners were witnessing was not excess, it was infrastructure. Behind every American meal stood a system designed years in advance, engineered, tested, and scaled for global war. The meat on a soldier's plate was not an accident of wealth. It was the final link in a chain that stretched from Midwest slaughterhouses to Pacific Island airstrips. The technological angle begins far from the battlefield. American industry had perfected large-scale food preservation decades earlier. Canning, refrigeration, dehydration, these were mature technologies by 1940. When war came, they were mobilized with precision. Meat packing plants increased output. Cold storage facilities expanded. Refrigerated ships were built specifically to carry protein across oceans. Japan, by contrast, had limited cold chain capacity. Refrigeration was scarce. Fuel shortages made frozen transport risky. Most Japanese rations were designed to be shelf-stable without refrigeration, practical but nutritionally limited. The result was visible in the field. American units could receive frozen beef, pork, and poultry even on remote islands. Field kitchens converted these supplies into hot meals. When refrigeration failed, canned meat filled the gap. Redundancy ensured continuity. Leadership played a decisive role. U.S. commanders did not view food as a luxury item to be cut when conditions worsened. It was protected. Convoys carrying rations were prioritized alongside ammunition. If a supply ship was lost, another followed. If an airstrip was damaged, engineers repaired it. Feeding soldiers was considered inseparable from fighting. This philosophy extended to prisoners of war. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to rations comparable to those of the captor's troops.
The United States adhered to this standard more consistently than most belligerents in the Pacific. Japanese prisoners received meals drawn from the same supply pools, sometimes reduced in portion size, but rarely in quality. For Japanese officers in captivity, this was particularly striking. They understood logistics, they recognized planning when they saw it, and they knew what their own army lacked by 1944. Observing American food distribution was not merely humiliating, it was instructional. Several post-war accounts describe Japanese officers watching American quartermasters with quiet attention. They noted schedules, quantities, waste management, the absence of panic even during supply delays. From a leadership perspective, it revealed a fundamental difference in wartime priorities. Japan had emphasized spiritual strength to compensate for material limitations. The United States had eliminated the need for compensation by overwhelming those limitations entirely. The moral angle followed naturally. American guards did not present food as charity. It was not offered as psychological warfare. It was simply administered. Meals were served at regular times. Leftovers were discarded according to sanitation rules. There was no ritual humiliation. This normalcy carried weight. For prisoners who had been taught that surrender meant disgrace and starvation, the reality was disorienting. Food arrived regardless of obedience or resistance. It did not need to be earned through endurance. This did not erase bitterness or ideological divide, but it introduced an uncomfortable truth. The enemy's system functioned smoothly even when extended to those it had defeated. And that system was built on scale. Daily meat was not symbolic, it was measurable. Calories calculated, protein allocated. Millions of tons of food moved across oceans with consistency. For Japanese soldiers, the realization was gradual but irreversible. This was not a temporary advantage, it was structural. An army that could feed its men like this could fight longer, recover faster, and replace losses without pause. It could absorb mistakes. It could sustain momentum. And by the time these truths settled in, the war itself was already turning decisively. Because food, once thought secondary, had revealed itself as a quiet determinant of victory. And soon there would come a moment, a specific turning point, when this realization crystallized fully. Not in theory, but in undeniable fact.
The turning point did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived with paperwork. By late summer 1944, American control of the Mariana Islands was complete. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had fallen after some of the bloodiest fighting of the Pacific War. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were dead, thousands more were captured, an outcome once considered nearly impossible by both sides. With the fighting ended, systems replaced chaos. Temporary prisoner compounds were formalized, medical screenings were conducted, Red Cross inspections were scheduled. Supply officers moved from emergency distribution to routine administration. For the first time, Japanese prisoners were able to observe the American logistical machine operating without the distortion of active combat. And what they saw was consistency. Every morning, supply trucks arrived on time. Field kitchens operated on rotation. Inventory lists were checked, not improvised. Meat was issued according to schedule, not as a surplus, not as a morale stunt, but as a standard component of the ration cycle. Daily meat was confirmed. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly, across weeks. This was the moment disbelief ended. Japanese officers, trained to read patterns, understood what this meant. A single shipment could be luck. Two could be coincidence. But a system that delivered protein daily on islands thousands of miles from its industrial base, even after heavy fighting, that was capacity on a different scale. Medical officers among the prisoners noticed it first.
They observed American soldiers recovering quickly from wounds. Weight remained stable. Disease rates were lower than expected in tropical conditions. Malnutrition, so common in Japanese units by 1944, was absent. Food explained much of it. American rations provided not only calories, but balance. Protein for muscle repair, fats for energy, vitamins to prevent deficiency. This was not accidental. It was the product of nutritional science applied at industrial scale. For Japanese prisoners suffering from prolonged hunger, the contrast was physical as well as psychological. Within weeks of captivity, many began to regain weight, edema reduced, energy returned. Medical records from U.S. camps documented improvement in former enemy soldiers once placed on American rations. The body responded immediately to regular protein intake. This biological response carried an unspoken message. The American system worked even on those it had defeated. The realization spread quietly through the camps. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouted acknowledgments. Japanese discipline and cultural reserve prevented outward reaction, but conversations shifted. Questions were asked. Officers compared notes. Why had their own army failed to provide this? The answer was no longer ideological, it was logistical. Japan simply could not do what the United States was doing. And the Americans did not hide it. Supply depots were visible. Refrigerated units hummed openly. Excess food was discarded when it spoiled, not hoarded. This behavior shocked men trained to stretch scarcity to its limit. In Japanese doctrine, waste was immoral. In American doctrine, waste was preferable to interruption. That difference mattered. As weeks passed, Red Cross inspectors documented the conditions. Reports confirmed that Japanese POWs were receiving rations comparable to U.S. troops. These were not public relations documents. They were internal records meant to verify compliance. But for the prisoners themselves, the inspection confirmed something deeper. The abundance was not temporary. It was policy. This realization marked the true psychological turning point. The war could no longer be understood solely through courage, sacrifice, or ideology. It had to be understood through factories, shipping lanes, refrigeration units, and calorie counts. And once that understanding took hold, the old assumptions collapsed quietly. Because if an enemy could feed its soldiers like this, every day, everywhere, then defeat was not a matter of tactics alone. It was built into the structure of the war itself. And as this truth settled in, its implications would deepen, reshaping how Japanese prisoners understood not just their captivity, but the outcome of the entire conflict.
Once the reality of American capacity was accepted, its psychological impact unfolded slowly, but relentlessly. For Japanese prisoners, the issue was no longer hunger, it was meaning. They had been taught that Japan fought with spirit against material excess, that endurance would compensate for shortage, that moral strength could offset industrial imbalance. These ideas had sustained soldiers through years of deprivation. But daily meat shattered that logic. It did so not through humiliation, but through repetition. Every meal reinforced the same conclusion. The United States was not straining to feed its army. It was operating comfortably, even at the edge of the world. This realization affected officers and enlisted men differently. For enlisted soldiers, it was deeply personal. Many had internalized hunger as a measure of worth. Seeing American soldiers remain strong without suffering forced a painful reassessment. Endurance alone had not made them equal opponents. For officers, the implications were strategic. They understood that war at this scale was no longer decided by battlefield brilliance alone. It was decided by systems. Japan's system had been outmatched long before the first shot was fired on Saipan. Quiet conversations among prisoners reflected this shift. Not despair, but clarity. They spoke of shipping losses, of fuel shortages, of the impossibility of matching American output. Food became shorthand for everything Japan lacked: steel, oil, transport, redundancy. The daily meat ration became symbolic, not because it was luxurious, but because it was routine. That routine revealed the truth propaganda could not obscure. American soldiers did not fight harder because they were hungrier. They fought harder because they were sustained. They could advance, pause, recover, and advance again without collapsing. In the broader war, this translated into momentum. By late 1944, American forces were advancing across the Pacific with increasing speed. Island hopping campaigns bypassed starving Japanese garrisons, leaving them isolated and powerless. Supply superiority allowed U.S. commanders to choose when and where to fight. The prisoners understood this. They had lived the consequences of isolation. They had watched rations shrink. They had seen units weaken without combat. Now they were witnessing the opposite, a force that grew stronger the longer it fought. Food was not the only factor, but it was the most visible. It could be smelled, counted, timed, and it never stopped coming. This understanding did not lead to bitterness toward individual American soldiers. Many prisoners noted that guards treated food distribution as administrative routine. There was no triumphalism, no emphasis on contrast. That, too, carried weight. The absence of mockery made the lesson unavoidable. There was no emotional defense against it. Post-war interviews would later capture this moment with restraint. Former Japanese soldiers did not describe anger. They described surprise, reflection, acceptance. One officer summarized it simply: "We realized the war was already decided before we landed." That realization, born not in battle, but in the mess line, marked the true end of illusion. From that point forward, captivity became a period of observation rather than resistance. Prisoners watched American operations with analytical detachment. They saw efficiency where they had been taught to expect decadence. Daily meat had become evidence. Evidence that the United States possessed not only superior firepower, but superior sustainability. And sustainability, in modern war, meant inevitability. As the Pacific Campaign continued toward Japan itself, this truth would extend beyond prison camps. It would shape post-war assessments, military reforms, and historical memory. But before those long-term consequences could be understood, the immediate effects of this realization had to play out in health, morale, and the quiet aftermath of defeat. Because the war's end did not arrive all at once. It arrived in stages. And one of those stages was being lived, meal by meal, behind barbed wire.
The effects of regular food were visible long before the war officially ended. Within weeks of captivity, American medical officers recorded measurable improvements among Japanese prisoners. Weight stabilized. Edema caused by prolonged protein deficiency began to recede. Symptoms of beriberi and chronic fatigue lessened. These were not anecdotal observations. They were logged, charted, and reported. Food changed bodies before it changed beliefs. For many prisoners, the transition was physically overwhelming. After months or years of scarcity, the body had adapted to deprivation. Digestive systems struggled at first.
Medical staff adjusted portions gradually, ensuring that rations restored health without causing harm. Even so, the contrast was unmistakable. Protein intake alone marked a dramatic shift. Meat, once rare, became routine. It repaired muscle tissue, restored strength, and improved immune response. Combined with consistent caloric intake, it reversed the slow deterioration that had plagued Japanese units across the Pacific. This recovery carried psychological consequences. Improved health brought clarity. Exhaustion lifted. Conversations lengthened. Prisoners who had existed in a fog of hunger began to reflect more deeply on their experience. The question was no longer how they had lost, but why defeat had become inevitable. American camp administration played a role. Food distribution was standardized. Meals were served at regular times. Discipline was enforced, but predictably. This stability contrasted sharply with the uncertainty of frontline life in the late Japanese war effort, where rations fluctuated wildly or disappeared entirely. The absence of hunger removed one of the most powerful stressors of captivity. For Japanese soldiers taught that surrender meant disgrace and starvation, the reality was disorienting. Survival no longer required constant calculation. Energy could be directed elsewhere, toward thought, observation, and eventually acceptance. U.S. reports from late 1944 and early 1945 reflect this shift. Guards noted improved behavior, reduced tension, and fewer medical emergencies. Camps became places of routine rather than crisis. This did not erase the trauma of defeat, but it reframed it. Former prisoners later described captivity as the moment they first fully understood the scale of American power, not through bombs or battles, but through consistency, through the realization that even enemy soldiers were being sustained by a system that did not strain to do so. Food became the clearest indicator. It was delivered regardless of circumstance, regardless of opinion, regardless of outcome. This had long-term effects on memory. In post-war interviews and memoirs, Japanese veterans frequently referenced food when discussing captivity, not as indulgence, but as revelation. It represented something tangible, something that could not be argued away. An army that could feed its enemies well was an army operating far beyond survival mode. For American planners, this outcome was not surprising. Quartermaster records show that feeding POWs was considered part of maintaining order and health, not an extraordinary burden. The same supply chains that sustained U.S. troops extended naturally to those in custody. The system absorbed them, and in doing so, it demonstrated a final contrast. Japan's war effort had asked its soldiers to endure hunger as proof of loyalty. The American war effort had eliminated hunger as a variable altogether. As the war moved toward its conclusion, this difference would influence how Japanese officers and soldiers assessed their own military traditions and how they imagined the future. Because defeat was no longer abstract. It had weight, it had calories, and it arrived 3 times a day.
When the war ended in August 1945, Japanese prisoners returned home carrying more than memories of combat. They carried observations. In the months following surrender, Allied authorities conducted extensive debriefings. Japanese officers and enlisted men were asked to assess what had gone wrong. Their answers varied, but certain themes appeared repeatedly: shipping losses, fuel shortages, industrial limits, and food. Not hunger alone, but the inability to prevent it. Former prisoners described captivity as the first time they had seen an enemy war effort operating without visible strain. The regularity of American meals stood in sharp contrast to the collapsing logistics they had experienced in the final years of the war. Food had become a lens through which everything else was understood. Post-war Japanese military analysts acknowledged that spiritual endurance could not compensate for systemic weakness. The belief that morale alone could overcome industrial imbalance was quietly abandoned. Modern war, they concluded, required sustained material support. This realization influenced Japan's post-war reconstruction. While the new self-defense forces would be shaped by different political constraints, logistical planning became central. Nutrition, supply reliability, and redundancy were emphasized in ways they had not been during the imperial era. The lesson had been learned, at great cost. American doctrine, meanwhile, was reinforced. U.S. military planners studied the Pacific War as proof that logistics won campaigns. Feeding soldiers adequately was not merely humane, it was decisive. The systems developed during World War II became templates for future conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam. Daily meat was no longer remarkable, it was expected. For historians, the story of American rations in the Pacific offers a quieter perspective on victory. It does not rely on dramatic battles or singular heroes. Instead, it reveals how outcomes are shaped by planning, production, and persistence. Japanese soldiers had laughed at American rations because they could not imagine them being real. They had assumed abundance was a weakness, unsustainable, wasteful, fragile. What they learned instead was that abundance, when engineered correctly, becomes resilience. Food, once thought peripheral, proved foundational. It sustained morale. It supported health. It allowed forces to remain in the field indefinitely. It turned distance into an advantage rather than a liability. And for those who experienced the contrast firsthand, this lesson never faded. In post-war interviews conducted decades later, veterans rarely described the taste of the food. They described its certainty, the fact that it arrived whether conditions were favorable or not. That certainty defined American power. Not cruelty, not indulgence, but predictability at scale. As the Pacific War receded into history, the memory of those meals remained. Quieter markers of a system that had outproduced, outlasted, and ultimately overwhelmed its enemy. And in that memory lay the final understanding. Wars are not won solely by the strength of soldiers, but by the strength of the systems that stand behind them. In war, victory is often remembered through battles, through maps, casualty figures, and the names of places where men fought and died. But beneath every engagement lies something quieter, something easier to overlook: sustainment. The Pacific War stretched across distances never before attempted by a modern army. It tested not only courage, but endurance at scale. And in that test, food became a measure of power as real as aircraft carriers or artillery. For Japanese soldiers, hunger had been framed as virtue. Endurance was expected to compensate for limitation. But history showed otherwise. No amount of spirit could replace missing calories. No ideology could substitute for broken supply lines. The Americans understood this early. They built factories instead of relying on faith. They counted calories as carefully as bullets. They treated food not as comfort, but as infrastructure. And by doing so, they removed hunger from the equation of combat. Daily meat was not a luxury, it was proof. Proof that an army could fight far from home without weakening. Proof that distance could be conquered by planning. Proof that modern war belonged to those who could sustain momentum indefinitely. For the Japanese soldiers who witnessed this from captivity, the lesson was profound and irreversible. They had not been defeated by individual men alone, but by an entire system. one that fed its soldiers, its wounded, and even its prisoners with the same steady rhythm, 3 meals a day. The war ended, empires fell, and doctrines changed, but the meaning of that contrast endured. It reshaped how nations thought about warfare, logistics, and responsibility. Because in the end, the outcome was decided long before the last shot was fired. It was decided in factories, in supply depots, and in the quiet certainty that tomorrow's meal would arrive, no matter how far from home the soldier stood. And that certainty, once seen, could never be unseen.